The day I asked Adrian for a divorce. The sea was only waist deep. That was the part everyone remembered first, as if shallow. Water made betrayal smaller. Celia went over the side of the floating pier with a bright, startled cry, one hand still reaching for the hat the wind had taken from her. I slipped after her because the boards were slick and my bad legs still stiffened in damp weather. By the time the cold hit my spine and the salt got into my mouth, Adrian had already jumped. He did not hesitate. He swam past me, past the wife who had spent 7 years learning the rhythm of his silences and the sharp corners of his pride, past the woman who knew exactly how many sugars he liked in his coffee and which shoulder hurt when he worked too late, past the mother of his son, straight to the woman he had once loved, before life, guilt, and obligation had bent him in my direction. Celia wrapped both arms around his neck. Adrian held her as if the sea itself had claws. I caught the rope ladder with numb fingers and dragged myself up alone, my knee screaming from the old injury I had never fully escaped. Rain spat sideways across the marina. My son Owen stood under the awning of the bait shop, dry and furious, more frightened by the interruption of his afternoon than by the sight of me coughing seawater onto the planks. Dad had to save Aunt Celia, he shouted. You know how to swim. He was 6, old enough to say cruel things clearly, young enough that everyone else would call them innocent. I rose slowly, every joint trembling, and looked at Adrian holding Celia on the wet boards while she shook dramatically in his arms. Her mascara had run just enough to make her seem fragile, not enough to make her ugly. She looked exactly like the kind of woman men wanted to protect, to prove something to themselves. I took off my wedding ring, wet skin resisting for a moment before it slid free. Let us divorce, I said. Adrian turned stunned, as if I had chosen the wrong line in a play we both knew by heart. He followed me back to the rental cottage we had taken for the long weekend and argued with me while salt dried on my skin. You were overreacting, he said, standing in the doorway while I pulled off my soaked sweater. Celia panicked. You did not. I laughed then, and the sound startled both of us. It was not a kind laugh. It was the laugh of a woman watching her last illusion split cleanly down the middle. That is supposed to help, I asked. Adrian shoved a hand through his wet hair. He was handsome in the polished way. Magazines liked dark coat, careful glasses, the kind of face that looked trustworthy, even when trust was the one thing missing. Mara, please be reasonable. Reasonable. I had been reasonable when he told me he had to keep in touch with Celia because they moved in the same charity circles. Reasonable when he took Owen to a science museum and came home smelling faintly of the perfume Celia had worn for years. Reasonable when my own exhibition invitation lay unopened for 3 days on his desk, while he remembered every date of Celia's marine lectures. Reasonable when he invited her to our family trip by accident, as if women like Celia simply materialized in first-class train compartments and private marinas. I opened the wardrobe, took out the document folder I always carried when traveling, and slid the prepared divorce papers onto the table between us. His expression changed, not because I wanted to leave, because I had been ready. You drafted these. Before today, I drafted them 3 months ago, I said. Today just made them honest. For the first time that evening, he looked afraid. Not devastated, not heartbroken. Afraid in the way men become afraid when something they thought was fixed in place suddenly acquires a will of its own. Owen wandered in while we were staring at one another and climbed onto the bed without asking why my hands were shaking. Is Aunt Celia staying for dinner? No, I said. Adrian answered at the same time. We will. See, that was the moment I understood with terrible clarity that if I stayed, I would have to fight not only the ghost of his first love, but the living habit of choosing myself last. I was too tired to compete with a woman who had never needed to win because the arena had been built for her in the first place. People like to believe marriages end with one dramatic event, but mine had been eroding for years in ways so fine and ordinary that even I had mistaken them for weather. When I first married Adrian, I believed, because he said it often, enough, that love could grow out of devotion. I had known him since I was 17 back, when my parents still ran a stationery shop near the old port and I painted after school. In the attic among paper dust and sea wind, Adrian was already dazzling then, the son of a family with money, influence, and a reputation for producing men who ran companies the way generals ran wars. He had come to our district to sketch the harbor for an architecture project and had somehow wandered into my father's shop because he liked the painted sign in the window. I fell in love the stupid, irreversible way girls do the first time a boy with beautiful manners remembers their name. Nothing happened then. He was older, brighter, already orbiting a girl from his own world. Celia Hart had laughing eyes, expensive horses, and a scholarship to study ocean conservation abroad. She fit beside him like 2 lines of a well-made poem. I watched from the margins and learned to keep quiet. Years later, after my parents died within 6 months of each other, I worked in a gallery gift shop and told myself I was content. Adrian reappeared during a storm on the cliff road outside Grey Glass Point, where my bus skidded and his car struck the guardrail. He would have gone over if I had not broken the side window and dragged him out through blood and rain. My knee was crushed between the door and the rock wall before anyone else arrived. He spent the next year calling my rescue a miracle and my injury a debt. He took me to appointments. He stood beside my hospital bed. He told me he had seen my loyalty when no one else had. I mistook gratitude sharpened by guilt for love because I wanted to. I was young enough to be hungry for being chosen, and he was determined enough to look convincing. We married after a year of pursuit, and everyone said I was lucky. I believed them, until I was no longer sure what luck was. Supposed to feel like the divorce itself was less dramatic than the end of the
marriage.
Adrian signed on the 4th day after 3 sleepless nights and 1 visit from his mother, who asked me to think of Owen, and then, when I did not bend, quietly asked her.
Son, what exactly he had done?
We had a prenuptial agreement drawn up by his father's lawyers. Adrian kept the company shares, the house, the cars, the investment accounts, and the certainty that none of those things had ever truly belonged to me. I kept my personal savings, my old sketch case, the oil-stained wooden paint box my father had made before he died, and the right to leave without explaining myself any further. Owen should stay with me, Adrian said, and I hated that he was right. Not because I loved my son less, because at 6 years old, he was already made of the same hard angles as his father. He liked structure, polish, winning. He loved the marble staircase, the driver in a black suit, the school with its crest sewn on every blazer pocket. He would not thrive with me in whatever uncertain life I built next, and perhaps, though I could barely admit it, then perhaps he no longer wanted the version of motherhood I had to offer. I knelt in front of him on his bedroom rug the night before I left. I'm going away for a while, I said. He held a little brass compass Adrian had bought him at a charity auction. Because you're angry, yes. Are you coming back?
When you are done?
The question should have softened me. Instead, it split me open, because he asked it with the calm assumption of a child who had never imagined his world could refuse
him.
I do not know, I said, honestly. He frowned. Aunt Celia says people say things they do not mean when they are jealous.
There it
Was the rot named aloud? I took the compass from his hand, closed his fingers back over it, and kissed his forehead. He did not kiss me back. He was not cruel in a theatrical way. He was simply distant, and distance can cut more cleanly than hatred ever could. When I wheeled my suitcase through the front gate the next morning, he watched from the upstairs window without waving. I did not look back a second time. There are departures that become impossible if you pause in the doorway, and I had already paused for years. I went north first, because grief always makes cowards of us, and the north was where no one expected me to go. There was a town beyond the breakwater, called Larkspur End, built around a disused lighthouse, a cold harbor, and an art residency people in the city only remembered when they wanted somewhere picturesque to recover. My mother had taken me there once when I was 10. We ate bread with blackberry jam on the seawall, and she told me the light changed faster there than anywhere else in the country. If you ever forget who you are, she had said, go somewhere the sky cannot lie to you. The residency director had rejected my application twice in the past, both times with polite notes that said my work showed promise but not commitment. They had been
right.
I sent a third application from a hotel room the night after the divorce hearing, attaching old sketches, newer private studies, and one raw statement that simply read, I have spent 10 years painting nothing because I was afraid to become someone outside a marriage I would like to begin badly if beginning well is too much to ask. Perhaps they pitied me. Perhaps they liked the honesty. Perhaps I had finally painted something true. A week later, they offered me a modest studio in an old customs house and 6 months of shared lodging in exchange for assisting with the restoration of the Harbor Museum murals. I arrived on a gray afternoon with one suitcase, my paint box, and a body that still ached in salt weather. Larkspur End smelled of whetstone, gulls, and frying butter from the bakery downstairs. The customs house overlooked a narrow cove where fishing boats rocked against their ropes like tired animals. My room was small enough that I could touch both walls if I stood in the middle and stretched out my arms, but the window was huge, and the sky beyond it was all weather and movement. No marble staircase, no polished silver fruit bowl, no husband waiting in a separate study with his back to the door. The woman who handed me the keys was named Mrs. Wren, 70 if she was a day, with braids like coiled rope and paint under her nails. She looked me up and down once and said, good, you look miserable enough to work. Seriously. I laughed for the first time in weeks. She nodded as if I had passed some invisible test. Kitchen's downstairs. If you cry, open the window first. Salt air makes sorrow less moldy. That was how my second life began, not with triumph, but with a key, a hard bed, and an elderly muralist giving practical advice about grief. The first month was not noble. It was ugly and repetitive and full of humiliations no one includes in stories about reinvention. I woke from dreams in which I was still in my old house and had to spend whole minutes remembering why the ceiling looked wrong. I burned soup. I forgot to buy matches. My knee locked halfway down the studio stairs one morning, and I sat there swearing until the baker's apprentice found me and offered a cinnamon roll in exchange for pretending he had not. I ruined 3 panels trying to match the green used in a century-old harbor map. I cried in the grocery store because a father was teaching his son how to choose right pears, and the ordinary tenderness of it hollowed me out. Adrian called from unknown numbers. His assistant called. His mother called. I answered none of them. The first time Owen's school number appeared on my screen, I nearly dropped the phone. I picked up to hear his classroom teacher asking whether I would still be available for the spring art fair volunteer rotation. I told her gently that she should call his father instead. There was a silence on the line, as if she had just realized that polite society gossip had been lagging several steps behind legal reality. At night, I painted until my wrists ached. Harbor ropes, rusted bollards, the underside of gull wings, the museum's cracked mural of ships from the old trade routes, fisherwomen mending nets beneath, storm lanterns. I painted badly, then less badly. I painted as if precision could keep regret from spilling onto the floor. Mrs. Wren watched without hovering. On the 12th night, she tapped the edge of my canvas with a maul stick and said, you paint like someone apologizing to the wall. I'm out of practice.
No.
Out of practice. Is a technical problem.
This is moral.
Panic. I blinked at her.
She snorted.
You keep trying to prove you deserve the paint. It is paint, not absolution. Stop bowing to it and use it. Then she left me alone with that unbearable, accurate sentence. The next morning I scraped away 2 days of careful work and started over. The sky in. The new version was rougher. The water darker. The people on the harbor wall stood straighter. It still was not good, but for the first time it looked like mine. By late autumn, the town had absorbed me the way small places do not dramatically, but through repetition. The baker downstairs,
Mr.
Hale, learned that I preferred my tea bitter. And my bread still warm, a retired ferry captain named Ivor brought me driftwood so I could test washes on interesting grain. 2 sisters from the local secondary school came every Saturday to help clean brushes in exchange for sketching lessons and gossip. From the city, the pharmacist with a thunderous laugh started setting aside joint cream before the rain came because he said my face told him my knee before the weather forecasted.
No.
One asked me to explain my marriage in full. They knew enough. Women in coastal towns always do. There was one man, though, who asked almost nothing and somehow saw too much. His name was Jonah Reed. He ran the salvage yard beyond the northern pier, where old ship lanterns, broken, weather vanes, copper fittings, snapped, oars, and stripped window frames went to wait for second lives. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and perpetually windblown, with a scar on one hand and the kind of quiet that did not feel withholding. The first time we met, he delivered a stack of reclaimed boards to the museum and stood in the doorway watching me wrestle with a
Warped frame.
"You are levering from the weak
Corner.
he said.
I know.
No. You are hoping the wood will forgive.
You? Different problem. It was so close to something Mrs. Wren would have said that I stared. He took the frame gently from my hands, reset the clamps, and showed me where the pressure needed to go. His movements were efficient, patient, not theatrical. When he finished, he stepped back as if there were no reason at all for me to think.
Him.
I learned later that his wife had died 3 winters before, not in any tragic, spectacular way, but from a slow illness that taught him how to live inside long
Helplessness.
He did not offer the information as a confession. I overheard it from Mr. Hale, who immediately looked guilty and tried to change the subject by giving me a free tart. Jonah became part of the edges of my week. He appeared with crates, hinges, old brass, the occasional impossible request from Mrs. Wren. Sometimes he brought tea in a thermos. If the wind was vicious, sometimes he stood beside my easel without speaking while I painted the tide turning silver under rain. He never once asked whether Adrian would come for me, for a woman fresh from a life built on someone else's assumptions. That restraint felt almost holy. The first time Adrian came to Larkspur End, he arrived in a coat too expensive for the town and parked his city car beside the bait shack as if class could be disguised by mud. I saw him from the museum window before he
Saw me.
My body recognized him before my mind did. Something old and obedient tightened under my ribs. Then he stepped out, looked around with open distaste, and the obedience died on the
Spot. Mrs.
Wren followed my gaze.
Ah, she.
Said the apology with cufflinks. Please, do not murder him. I'm too old for prison food. I will settle
For humiliation.
He came in carrying a bouquet of white roses. Not my flowers. Celia used to receive white roses after charity galas and post the cards online, where everyone could admire the handwriting of her admirers. I did not invite him to sit. Mara, he said with a softness he had probably practiced in the car.
You look. Well.
I look busy. He glanced around the studio, the scaffolds, drop cloths, pigment jars, the mural, transfer drawings pinned up like maps of a territory he had lost.
You did not answer
any of my calls. That is usually what happens when someone does not want to talk. His jaw hardened. I came because Owen has been asking
questions.
That was the first lie. I knew it at once. He had led with our son because children make the most efficient leverage.
What?
Questions. He wants to know why you left. And what did you tell him? Adrian set the flowers down on the only clean table and met my eyes.
That you
needed space. Did you tell him why? He is a child. He was a child when you let him believe his mother was small enough to replace. A flicker of shame crossed his face, then
was gone.
Celia is not replacing anyone. Then stopped carrying her into every room I once occupied. He exhaled sharply, as if I were the one making conversation impossible. You have had months to cool down. I understand that the marina incident was unfortunate, but unfortunate. I repeated. You're choosing the ugliest interpretation of something that happened in seconds. No, Adrian. I'm finally choosing the accurate one. He said my name again, more sharply this time. I never betrayed you. The room went utterly still around us. Even the gulls seemed to pause. I know, I said. That is the worst part. Betrayal would have required a choice you knew was wrong.
What
you did was instinct. You showed me where I stood without ever intending to be cruel. He looked at me as if I had struck him. I picked up the roses and held them out. Take these to someone who still mistakes. Ceremony for love. He left without them.
Mrs.
Wren put them in a bucket by the back door, where they looked beautiful for 3 days, and then browned at the edges all at once. News from the city arrived in pieces. The way bad weather does. Some came through Adrian's mother, who still sent me short, guilty messages on holidays. Some came through newspapers left folded at the bakery. Some came through the kind of people who moved between rich houses and service doors, carrying gossip the way bees carry pollen. I learned that Celia had become the public face of a foundation focused on coastal erosion, which meant her photograph appeared constantly beside Adrian at fundraisers, planning dinners, sailing regattas, and environmental auctions. She wore pale colors, perfect earrings and the expression of a woman who understood exactly how Light loved her. I also learned that she had moved into a townhouse 10 minutes from Adrian's office, and that Owen spent every other Saturday at her conservation center feeding rescued seabirds with plastic tongs. I pretended none of it mattered. Then one evening I painted until midnight and accidentally turned the sea in my canvas, the exact blue of the dress Celia had worn at our wedding reception. I cut the canvas off the frame. The next morning, Jonah found me in the alley, behind the museum, shoving the rolled painting into a rubbish bin, too small to hold it. That seems expensive, he said. It is rotten. He crouched, pulled the canvas back out, and unrolled it enough to see the surface.
No.
Angry, yes.
Rotten. No.
I do not want to. Look at it, then paint over it. That answer irritated me because it was sensible. He leaned one shoulder against the wall.
My
Wife used to say destruction feels clean, but costs twice.
First you make the thing, then you grieve it.
Better to revise if the bones are good. I stared at the torn edge flapping in the
wind.
Are the bones good? He asked. I thought about the underpainting, the careful values, the line of the breakwater.
Yes.
Then do not give the rubbish what belongs to.
Work.
He carried the canvas back inside, without waiting for my permission. I followed because what else was there to do? That night I painted over the blue dress, with storm clouds interned the empty space, at the center into a lantern post lit against incoming dark. It became one of the strongest pieces I had made all year, though I never told Jonah he had saved it. Some debts are better honored by making use of what was given than by speaking of them aloud. Winter arrived early, and with it came Owen. Not because Adrian suddenly wanted to share.
Him.
The boy came with his school's half-term project on local harbor ecosystems and a nanny who resigned on the train platform after discovering Larkspur End had one decent inn and no luxury shopping. Adrian called from the station sounding both irritated and exhausted. There's no one else to leave him with for 3 days, he said. My mother is in Zurich. Celia is on an expedition vessel. I have a board crisis in London. I almost laughed at the neatness of that hierarchy. Mother abroad, former lover at sea, wife, abandoned in an old customs house promoted, at last to emergency childcare. I am not your backup plan. He is your
Son.
There are sentences that keep women in bad marriages for generations. That was one of them. Put him on the phone, I said. There was rustling, then Owen's voice, smaller than I remembered. Mom, I closed
My eyes.
Do you want to come here, eh? Pause. Dad says it is boring.
Probably.
Another pause. Will there be golf? Yes. Can I bring my sketchbook? The answer rose from somewhere I had been trying not to touch. Yes, baby. Bring a warm coat too. When he arrived, he looked taller, thinner, and uncertain. City polish had sharpened
Him.
He wore a navy peacoat that probably cost more than my first easel and clutched a canvas satchel like a child trying very hard not to look like one. He stopped 2 feet from me and seemed to forget the script he had prepared. I crouched as far as my knee allowed. Hello.
Hi.
That was all. No rushing into my arms, no dramatic refusal, just distance with a heartbeat inside it. The first evening was awkward enough to make the walls sweat. He inspected my room with frank disbelief. This is your kitchen.
Yes.
It is tiny.
Yes.
He ate stew at the little table and kept glancing around as if somewhere between the kettle and the window a proper house might reveal itself. After dinner, he took out his school project sheet and frowned at the line that asked him to interview a local artist about the relationship between landscape and memory. Do you know any artists? He asked. I looked at him for a long moment.
I know.
One. His ears pinked. I mean a real one. I will introduce you tomorrow, I said, and spared us both by not smiling. Children reveal themselves most honestly when they are tired, and by the second night, Owen had become honest without meaning to. He followed me to the Harbor Museum in the morning, where Mrs. Wren made him tea so sugary it could have stripped paint, and promptly recruited him to
Count brushes.
He adored Jonah within 10 minutes because Jonah treated him like a competent apprentice instead of a decorative
Inconvenience.
He hated the smell of linseed oil, was afraid of eels, and loved drawing machinery with surprising precision. He also kept saying Aunt Celia says before stopping mid-sentence whenever he caught my face. Change. In the afternoon, we walked the breakwater for his project. Wind lifted his hair off his forehead. He asked questions in the serious, tumbling way he had before he learned that affection could be bartered for elegance. Why do people paint the same place more than once? Because places keep changing. But the lighthouse stays where it is.
The
Lighthouse stays, I said. The sky does not. The water does not. The person looking does not. He thought about that so hard he nearly walked into a bollard. That evening he found a box of my old sketchbooks under the window seat while looking for extra blankets. I had meant to move them higher, but work and cowardice had delayed me. He sat cross-legged on the rug, turning pages in silence. There I was at 19, painting bus stations and gull wings. There I was pregnant and sketching baby socks beside hospital magazines. There were drawings of him as an infant asleep on my chest, his fist tangled in my hair. There were portraits of Adrian in profile, over and over from the first years of marriage, the face of a man I had once believed I would spend my life studying with. Gratitude. Owen looked up slowly. You made all these?
Yes.
Why did not you hang them in the house? Because no one asked. Because they did not match the interior designer's plans. Because I slowly learned not to take up wall space unless invited. Because love can become a room you tiptoe through until even your joys learn to whisper. Instead I said, life got busy. He touched a page where I had painted his baby. Hand curled around my thumb. Dad said you stopped painting because you got bored. I folded a shirt at the end of the bed with more care than it required. Your dad says many things when he wants a story to be tidy. Owen lowered his head. Again, his voice came very small. Aunt, Celia says, women are happiest when they do not make one thing their whole personality. That sounds like something a woman says when she has never had to give anything up. I replied before I could stop myself. He
Flinched. So did I.
I sat down on the rug. Opposite him, listen to me carefully, Owen. Adults can like each other without one of them being right about everything. I am not asking you to choose me over anyone. I am asking you to think with your own mind, not borrow someone else's. He nodded, but children nod long before they understand. Still, it was the beginning. On the third day, the storm came in. Larkspur End did not fear storms the way the city feared scandal. It prepared for them, cursed them, and kept moving. Mr. Hale sandbagged his cellar door. Jonah helped the harbor office secure loose signage. Mrs. Wren stalked through the museum, swearing at windows built by men who had apparently never met rain. Owen, thrilled by the drama of it all, kept pressing his nose to the glass until I ordered him away. The power went out just after dusk. We lit candles, moved into the downstairs kitchen for warmth, and ate toast with jam while the wind battered the walls. Owen drew lighthouses by candlelight and made the windows in every picture too large. When thunder cracked over the cove, he startled hard enough to knock his tea over.
Himself?
I reached him first, dabbing his sleeve with a towel while he blinked at me, embarrassed by his own fear. I'm fine, he muttered.
No.
I was not scared. Of course not. You only tried to leap out of your skin. Recreationally. That earned the smallest ghost of a smile. Later, when the worst of the storm had passed, I found him asleep curled in the armchair with my old blue shawl over his knees. His hair had fallen into his eyes. In sleep, he looked painfully like the baby who used to crawl into my lap with crayons before taste and influence and adult hunger rearranged his loyalties. I covered him properly and sat down on the floor beside him because I did not trust myself to stand. There is a grief particular to motherhood, the grief of loving someone who is still becoming and therefore can wound you without knowing which blade he picked up. I had spent months turning Owen into a symbol of what I had lost because symbols are easier to manage than living children. Sitting there in the candlelight, listening to him breathe, I understood how unfair that had been. He had been taught, he had absorbed, he had chosen badly, yes, but he was still in the years when bad choices look like inheritance rather than character. When Adrian arrived the next morning, delayed by weather and moneyed inconvenience, he found Owen in the studio, wearing one of Jonah's oversized work aprons and using charcoal to map current lines across the harbor.
This is fascinating, Jonah was saying.
You have drawn the tide like machinery. Adrian stopped dead on the threshold. His gaze went from our son's blackened fingers to the open sketchbook on the table. To me, holding a rag and standing easy in a room where I no longer sought his approval, something tightened in his face that might once have pleased me. Ready to go? He asked Owen. Our son hesitated. It was only a second, but Adrian saw it.
So did I.
That hesitation was the first crack in the story he had been telling himself about who belonged to whom, after Owen left the house, felt louder in its emptiness. For 2 days I found evidence of him. Everywhere, one sock under the bench, a careful graphite lighthouse on scrap paper, toast crumbs under the radiator, a child's question still hanging in the air. Then the evidence was gone, absorbed into cleaning and routine, and I was furious with myself for missing him when he had been so willing to wound me. I worked harder. By Christmas, the museum restoration had turned into my first major independent commission. The town council wanted a triptych for the renovated Sea Hall, a set of large oils depicting Larkspur End across 3 generations, the age of sail, the storm flood years, and the present. Mrs. Wren refused the job and recommended me with a confidence that felt, frankly, irresponsible. She needs to stop waiting for permission, I overheard her tell the
Council chair.
also, if you give it to a man, he will paint heroics. She will paint people. This town needs people. So I painted fishwives and signal fires, rope burns and rescue lanterns, old women gutting mackerel beneath election posters, children in knitted hats kicking seafoam, teenagers kissing behind bait crates, and the breakwater holding all of them together through weather no one could fully
Control.
For the central panel, I painted the lighthouse not as a monument, but as a witness, chipped, watchful, ordinary from close up, magnificent from a distance.
The
Work consumed me in the cleanest possible.
way.
Hours passed without self-surveillance. Some evenings Jonah cooked for me because I forgot food existed. Once he stood behind me very quietly, adjusting the lamp height while I mixed cobalt, and I realized my whole body had stopped bracing around male presence. That frightened me more than any flirtation could have. He must have sensed it because he stepped away at once. I only came to save your eyes, he said. They are attached to me. I am aware. There was the smallest curl at the corner of his mouth. I looked back at the canvas, heartbeat suddenly louder than the room. Healing is not dramatic when it happens properly. It is made of tiny, undignified moments. Allowing someone to hand you a jar without suspicion, letting your own shoulders lower, noticing that silence in a room no longer always means danger. That winter I learned I could survive not being chosen first by the people who once defined me. By spring, I began to wonder what it might mean to choose myself without apology. Adrian returned in March with no flowers, and for once, no polished argument prepared. In advance, he looked older, not ruined, not tragic, simply weathered at the edges. The city had put its gray thumbprint under his eyes. His tie was crooked. He stood in my studio doorway watching the triptych dry and said nothing for so long I almost told him to leave out of sheer irritation. Finally he spoke. Owen talks about this place constantly. I wiped my brush and
Waited.
he asked if currents can be drawn mathematically and artistically at the same time. He wants a drafting desk for his birthday.
That sounds like him.
He says Jonah owns 3 boat engines and pieces and swears. That is a sign of wisdom.
That sounds less.
Like him. Adrian almost smiled. It vanished. Quickly. He is changing. Children do. His gaze moved to my hands, stained with ultramarine and umber.
So are you?
That, at least, was true. He stepped farther in, slowly enough that I could have objected. I read the catalog essay, he said.
Mrs.
Wren sent it to my mother. The line about the breakwater surviving not because it resists the sea, but because it knows where to give, yes, it sounded like you.
Then Mrs.
Wren is a better critic than you ever were. The truth of that landed between us with a dull little thud. Adrian rubbed his mouth, weary suddenly. I deserve that. I set the brush down.
Why are you here?
He looked around the studio as if the room might help him answer, because I was.
Wrong.
About what? About many things. About Celia. About you. About myself. I leaned against the work table and crossed my arms. You will need to be more specific. Men say they were wrong all the time when what they mean is they dislike the consequences. His shoulders dropped.
Fine.
I believed gratitude could become love if I practiced it long enough. I thought admiration, loyalty, and habit were close enough to the real thing that no one would notice the difference. When Celia came back, I told myself what I felt was nostalgia.
Then I encouraged Owen's
attachment to her because it made my own seem less shameful. The bluntness of it cut cleaner than excuses ever had. I waited because some truths arrive only if you are silent long enough. He swallowed, then you left. And for the first time in years, nothing in my life arranged itself around my comfort. Owen stopped trusting me. The house felt like a stage after the audience goes home. Celia wanted excitement, not accountability. She liked being desired, not being needed. When I got ill in January and ended up in hospital for 2 nights, she sent orchids and did not come. I should have felt satisfaction. Instead, I only felt tired. So, now you finally understand me, I asked. No, he said quietly. I think I finally understand what I destroyed. For a moment, the room held an older version of us. One that might have cried or forgiven or mistaken confession for repair. But that version of me had not survived the Marina, you destroyed a life that depended on your blindness, I said. That is not the same as destroying me. He closed his eyes. When he opened them again, there was water. In them, I did not trust. Is there truly no way back? I looked past him through the window at the tide moving under. Slate-colored sky.
The tide goes out, I said, but it does.
Not return the same water? He stood there a long time as if trying to memorize the shape of refusal. Then he nodded once and
left.
This time, when the door shut, I felt no triumph at all. Only peace. In May, Owen came alone. Not entirely alone, of course. Adrian's driver brought him, and the housekeeper fussed over his collar on the platform. But emotionally, he arrived without the shield of his father's presence, and that made him vulnerable in a way I had never
seen before.
He was taller again. Childhood was fleeing him in visible increments. I asked to come, he said before I could question it, as if rehearsed honesty would give him courage. Dad did not make me. I nodded and took his bag. For the first several hours, he behaved like a diplomatic envoy from a small hostel state. He thanked me too formally for tea, spoke about school as though reading minutes from a meeting, and inspected my shelves without touching anything. Then he found a sketch I had done of him in the storm, asleep in the armchair with my shawl over his knees. You drew me, he said. Yes. I looked younger. You were. He stood there a long time. You kept it. Yes. He put the paper down carefully. Why? The question was too large for the room and too old for his age. I sat on the edge of the sofa and answered him the only way I could, because even when I was angry with you, I still loved you. His face changed. Not all at once, but enough. Children do not know what to do with unconditional love once they have begun to suspect they may not deserve it. At dinner, he barely ate. At bedtime, he lingered in the doorway of the spare room. Mom, yes. Did Aunt Celia really want to be my mother? There it was, the true injury. At last, I could have lied. It would have been kinder in the short term. But kindness that depends on falsehood becomes interest-bearing debt. I do not know what she wanted, I said. I know she liked being important to your father, and I know adults sometimes drag children into feelings they should handle themselves. He stared at the floorboards. I said terrible things to you. Yes. You still asked me to stay. Yes. Why? Because love is often wiser than pride. Because I refuse to let the worst version of him become the only version I ever met. Because my own parents died before they could disappoint me much, and maybe that made me foolishly loyal to all unfinished bonds. Instead, I opened my arms. He came to me in 2 steps and hit my chest, with all the force of a child trying not to
cry.
I held him while his body shook. He did not apologize immediately. Real remorse is
slower than that.
But when he finally whispered, I thought if I liked her, Dad would smile more. I understood everything that had mattered. Not forgiven. Understood. That was enough for the night. Summer transformed Larkspur End into a place of color and noise, and with it came my first exhibition under my own name. Until then, I had shown work locally under initials, or through group catalogs. Mrs. Wren called this romantic cowardice and bullied the gallery on the East Quay into giving me the back room for 6 weeks. Jonah built the frames. Mr. Hale catered the opening with pastries far too elegant for the walls. The secondary school girls wrote my labels by hand because they declared printed ones emotionally cold. I titled the show Breakwater. There were harbor studies, storm skies, working hands, the overpainted lantern, canvas, the triptych cartoons, and one large self-portrait so indirect that only people who knew me well understood it was me. A woman seen from behind, standing on wet boards with one shoe. Missing, not drowning, not rescued, simply turning away from the water toward an inland road. Adrian sent a note asking if he might attend. I did not answer. He came anyway. So, did Owen in a pale blue shirt and a tie clearly chosen by himself because it had tiny silver anchors on it. He stood beside the self-portrait for nearly 10 minutes while pretending to read the label. When he finally came over, he said,
Is that from the marina? Yes.
He
Swallowed.
You painted yourself leaving?
Yes.
He looked at the floor. Did it hurt?
What? Leaving?
The room around us blurred for a second, voices and clinking. Glasses going distant.
Yes, I said.
Very much. He nodded as if confirming a private.
Theorem.
Then, in the solemn tone he used when he wanted to be brave, he said, I'm glad you still did it. That may have been the moment. I forgave him, though I did not tell him so. Forgiveness is less a declaration than a loosening. Something in me unclenched. Across the room, Adrian stood looking at the same painting. There was no Celia beside
Him.
no dramatic rival to blame, only the shape of his own absence made visible in pigment. Jonah came up with 2 glasses of sparkling water and offered one to Owen first. My son accepted it without suspicion, which pleased me more than it should have. When Jonah moved away again, Owen leaned closer and whispered, I like him.
So do.
I said before I could edit myself. His eyes widened, then unexpectedly, he smiled. Not the polished smile he used at school. Ceremonies. The real one, crooked and young, and briefly free of all the adults who had burdened him with symbolism. When the show sold out in 3 weeks, I did not think of Adrian at all. I thought of paint, rent, and the fact that for the first time since I was 20, my own work had paid for my own future. Celia wrote to me once. The letter arrived in late August on cream. Stationery heavy enough to imply innocence. I almost threw it away unopened, but curiosity is a vice made respectable by good penmanship. Mara, it began. I think there has been unnecessary hostility between us, and because I'm trying to become a more honest person, I wanted to offer clarity.
Adrian?
And I never had a physical affair. He was, however, emotionally confused for a long time. I regret that your marriage became tangled with feelings that were unresolved before either of us behaved responsibly. I am engaged now and will be moving to Lisbon before winter. I hope this gives everyone the closure they need. Closure in her hand looked like a yacht called Mercy. I sat at my kitchen table and laughed so hard I startled the cat from next door, who had adopted me by stealth over the summer. Then I wrote back on the back of one of my failed sketch studies because respect should be proportionate. Celia, I'm delighted you are taking your unresolved feelings to another country. Please do not mistake distance for virtue. There is no hostility left on my side, because I am no longer in the competition. You imagined. I hope Lisbon teaches you what coastlines teach everyone eventually. Beauty is not the same as depth. I did not sign it with love or regards. I signed it simply Mara Song because using the name I was born with felt better than any knife. After mailing the letter, I walked to the salvage yard where Jonah was cataloging brass fittings in the sun. I have done something petty, I announced. He looked up thoughtfully. Productive, petty, or ornamental, petty, productive, I hope. Then congratulations. I sat on an overturned crate and watched him work. Do you ever worry that becoming peaceful means becoming dull all the time? That does not reassure me. He smiled. Peace and dullness are often confused by people who need constant damage to feel alive. I considered that while a gull tried to steal his sandwich. The truth was that peace had begun to feel not dull, but startlingly
Spacious.
My days were full. My work had direction. Owen visited for 2 weeks at the end of summer and asked if he might spend part of Christmas with me too. Adrian did not contest it. Somewhere in the city he was learning, perhaps for the first time, that love is not a leverage. Celia was leaving. The old triangle had dissolved, and in its place stood something much harder to name. A life not organized around being chosen. That evening Jonah walked me home and stopped at my door as he always did, neither lingering nor retreating too quickly.
Mara, he said, if I asked you to dinner?
On a day when no crisis existed, would that be welcome or tiresome? I looked at his scarred hand, his cautious mouth, the honesty in him that never tried to earn extra credit by sounding poetic. It would be welcome, I said.
Good, he
Replied. I have been trying not to be a nuisance for
6 months.
You have mostly succeeded. Mostly I pretended to think.
You do.
Meddle with my frames. They deserve better. A leverage. There in the yellow wash of the harbor.
Lamps. I laughed into the beginning of
Something new. A year later, on the day the first winter. Light struck the new sea hall windows. I stood beneath my triptych with paint on my cuffs and felt no urge to check who had entered behind me. The town had asked me to speak to a group of scholarship students about art, work, and the undignified business of beginning again. Owen sat in the front row beside the secondary school girls who had once cleaned my brushes. He had come for the weekend carrying a drafting set and a drawing of the harbor, rendered with an engineer's discipline and an artist's patience. Adrian had sent him with a note that contained only train times and a quiet thank you for returning the boy happier than he
left.
It was the best letter he had ever written me because it wanted nothing. Jonah stood at the back near the doors, not because he was uncertain anymore, but because he knew I liked seeing him there. When I finished, love, I had learned, was not the grand rescue performed before an audience. It was the person who remembered where to place the lamp so your eyes would not strain, the one who held the ladder steady while you climbed, the one who listened when you spoke of old wounds without reaching for them as tools. When the students asked what the central lesson of the year had been, I looked up at the painted breakwater and answered without hesitation. You do not have to win against another woman to lead the wrong life. I said, you do not have to become colder, prettier, richer, or more useful than the ghost you were compared to. Sometimes dignity begins the day you stop competing for a love that was never worthy of the contest. Outside, the tide struck the harbor wall and withdrew, bright as cut glass. After the talk, Owen slipped his hand into mine as naturally as breathing. Jonah met us on the steps with 3 paper cups of hot cider, 1 for each of us.
The
Sea wind lifted my hair. My knee ached little in the cold, but not enough to matter. For the first time in many years, I was not somebody's second choice, not somebody's
duty, not somebody's almost.
I was simply myself, walking toward the water with the people who had learned to walk beside me.